The courtroom smelled like burnt coffee and broken promises. It wasn't just the air. It was the whole place, soaked in years of bad choices and even worse outcomes. The wooden benches gleamed from constant polishing, but no amount of shine could hide the deep grooves left by restless hands, shifting under the weight of injustice. At the defendant's table sat 15-year-old Zoe Harper, her oversized hoodie draped over her small frame like a shield. It was clear the hoodie had passed through more hands than a well-worn library book. Her dark, curly hair was thrown into a messy bun, and her eyes, sharp, unyielding, dared anyone in the room to underestimate her. Spoiler, most already had. On the bench, Judge Jason Reed loomed over the courtroom like a relic of a bygone era, his expression one of permanent disapproval. He had the kind of face that made you want to roll your eyes on sight, thin lips pressed into a smug line, thick glasses perched on his nose like they were there to reinforce his sense of superiority. And today, he was staring at Zoe like she was nothing more than a waste of his time. "Miss Harper," Judge Reed began, his voice dripping with disdain, "do you even comprehend why you're here, or do you think this is some kind of joke?" Zoe leaned back in her chair, arms crossed over her chest, looking for all the world like she owned the place. "A joke?" "No, Your Honor," she said, tilting her head slightly. "This is way more entertaining than that." A smirk played on her lips, the kind that screamed, "Try me." A murmur rippled through the room. The spectators, mostly small-town folks with nothing better to do, whispered among themselves, eating up the courtroom drama like it was a midday soap opera. Even Zoe's public defender, a tired-looking woman on the edge of burnout, shot her a sideways glance that screamed, "Are you out of your mind?" But Zoe wasn't reckless. She was furious. 2 nights ago, she had done the unthinkable. She had broken into the local police station, not for fun, not for a dare, but because she had no other choice. They had arrested Will, a homeless veteran who was more family to her than anyone else in the world. His crime? Stealing a loaf of bread. A loaf of bread. Zoe knew Will. He wasn't some petty criminal. He was a man who had given everything for a country that had given him nothing in return. When her father left and her mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, Will was the one who taught her how to keep her chin up, how to stand tall even when the world tried to crush her. But the cops? They didn't see that. All they saw was a black man they could toss into a cell to boost their arrest numbers. For hours, Zoe paced her tiny bedroom, her mind spinning through every possible solution. She couldn't just let them railroad Will. She wouldn't. So she did what any desperate kid with nothing to lose would do. She grabbed her laptop, threw on a hoodie, grabbed a flashlight, and walked straight into the lion's den. The break-in was messy. She planned to slip in unnoticed, but reality had other plans. Turns out, avoiding cops isn't as easy as the movies make it look. Still, she got what she needed, a USB drive packed with files that proved Will's innocence. But that wasn't all she found. Buried deep in the police department's ancient computer system, she found something else. A folder labeled Case 347. She didn't know what it was, but her gut told her it was important, so she copied it. And then, everything went to hell. Alarms blared before she could even unplug the drive. Zoe barely made it out, sprinting through dark streets, heart pounding, clutching the USB like her life depended on it. When she finally made it home, she opened the files. And that's when she realized she hadn't just stolen proof that Will was innocent. She had uncovered a conspiracy, bribes, false arrests, tampered evidence, a whole system designed to trap people who looked like her. And guess whose name kept showing up? Judge Jason Reed. Now, sitting in this courtroom, staring at the very man whose career she could destroy with one tiny flash drive, Zoe felt a slow, burning satisfaction creep into her chest. "Miss Harper," Reed said, his voice as sharp as a blade, "you are facing serious charges. Tampering with evidence, breaking and entering, theft. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Zoe stood up, slow and deliberate. The room fell silent. She reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out the USB. "Oh, I have plenty to say," she said, holding it up like a winning lottery ticket. "But first, Your Honor, I have a question for you." Reed narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" "How do you sleep at night?" Zoe asked, tilting her head. "Like, seriously? 2 pillows or 3? Because with all the garbage you've covered up, I imagine you need extra support for that guilty conscience of yours." Gasps shot through the courtroom. Even the bailiff's lips twitched like he wanted to clap. Reed's face turned red, his hand tightening around his gavel. "That is enough," he barked, slamming it down. "Sit down." But Zoe didn't sit. She took a step forward. "You can yell all you want," she said, her voice ringing through the room. "But I am not the one who should be on trial here." She held up the flash drive. "This drive? It's got everything. Fake arrests, rigged trials, payoffs, and guess whose name pops up the most?" For the first time, Reed looked shaken. Zoe smirked. "Yeah," she said. "That's what I thought." The courtroom held its breath. No one moved. No one dared breathe. And then, as if dropping the final match on a powder keg, Zoe plugged the USB into a laptop she'd brought with her. The ancient machine, held together with duct tape and hope, flickered to life. She turned the screen to face the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Zoe announced, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins, "I present Exhibit A, the truth." The first file played, a surveillance video of 2 cops planting drugs in a teenager's car during a routine traffic stop. Gasps. The second file, a spreadsheet listing hundreds of names, all black or brown, arrested for nonsense like loitering or jaywalking. Next to each name, notes on how much time they'd served, and how much funding the police department received for each one. Murmurs turned into full-blown outrage. The third file, an email thread between Judge Reed and the police chief, discussing how to fix certain cases. Chaos. People stood, shouted. Judge Reed slammed his gavel, voice cracking under the weight of panic. "Turn that off! This is a blatant attempt to derail." "Derail?" Zoe cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. "No, Your Honor, this isn't derailing the case." She leaned forward, her smirk widening. "This is the case." And just like that, Judge Jason Reed's world started to crumble. The courtroom reeked of stale coffee and regret. It wasn't just the air, it was in the walls, in the floors, in the way the benches groaned under the weight of too many broken promises. Justice had never lived here. At the defendant's table sat 15-year-old Zoe Harper, her oversized hoodie swallowing her frame like a battle-worn armor. Her dark curls were pulled into a loose bun, but it was her eyes, sharp, unyielding, that dared anyone to doubt her. Spoiler, most already had. From the bench, Judge Jason Reed peered down at her, his usual sneer in place, but this time there was something else beneath it. Unease. "Miss Harper," Reed's voice rang out, stiff and measured, "you are dangerously close to contempt of court." There was a tremor beneath his words, faint but there. He knew she had him. Zoe leaned forward, her voice dropping low, each syllable landing like a punch. "Contempt of court?" She let the words settle. "Try living with contempt for a system that's supposed to protect you, but I guess you wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The room erupted into applause. For a split second, Zoe felt the weight shift in her favor. The people in the courtroom, spectators, reporters, even a few jurors, were no longer just watching. They were listening. And then she saw him. A man in a crisp suit sitting at the back, expression blank. The kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. He stood up and walked out. Not in a hurry, not panicked, just leaving. And that sent an ice-cold shiver down Zoe's spine. Something wasn't right. As the court officers scrambled to regain order, Zoe's gaze flickered to her mother in the audience. Her mom looked terrified, more afraid than Zoe had ever seen her. And in that moment, Zoe understood. This wasn't just about a corrupt judge. This wasn't just about a broken system. She had kicked a hornet's nest, and what she was up against wasn't going down without a fight. For the first time, she wondered if she was in over her head. The web tightens. The tension in the room felt electric, charged, like a live wire buzzing, ready to snap. Zoe clutched her laptop, her knuckles white against the worn-out plastic. It was her last line of defense. Judge Reed's face was a mask of fury, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked nervously around the room, calculating, trying to measure just how much damage she could do before he found a way to silence her. Murmurs swelled around her, turning into whispered curses, then outright accusations. Some demanded answers, some demanded justice, and a few, still too afraid to believe, told her to sit down. But she wasn't sitting. Not now. Not ever. "Miss Harper," Reed hissed, his voice barely restrained. "I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, but I assure you, this is going nowhere." Zoe tilted her head, smirking. "Nowhere? That's funny, Your Honor. Feels like we're heading straight for the truth. And that seems to make you really uncomfortable." The door at the back of the courtroom slammed, all eyes turned. The man in the suit was back, but this time, he wasn't alone. Two others flanked him, dressed in dark suits with earpieces that screamed government. The first man, a middle-aged guy with a face so blank it could have been a chalkboard, strode straight to the bench and handed Judge Reed a folded paper. Reed's lips tightened as he read it. Then he looked up, his face drained of color. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice unsteady, "we are taking a brief recess." The suited men moved in. "Bailiff," Reed added quickly, "escort the defendant into custody." The words hit Zoe like a slap. Custody? Two officers rushed forward, their hands already reaching for her arms. The courtroom exploded. People were shouting. Her mother stood up, voice breaking. "She's just a kid." But the officers didn't care. Rough hands gripped her, yanking her away from the table, away from the laptop she had fought so hard to protect. "Wait!" Zoe twisted in their grip, her voice rising. "You can't do this. The files are—" Her words were drowned out in the chaos. She watched helplessly as one of the suited men snatched her laptop off the table. And just like that, her leverage was gone. The fire burns. They threw her into a holding cell, a small, cold box with walls that felt like they were closing in. Zoe paced, her mind racing, replaying every moment from the courtroom, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. She had been so close, so damn close. Now, she was locked up like a criminal while the real villains walked free. A key turned in the lock. The door creaked open, and one of the suited men stepped in. He shut the door behind him, his face unreadable. "Miss Harper," he said, voice calm, eerily detached. "You've caused quite a stir." Zoe crossed her arms, her jaw set. "Good, maybe it'll wake people up." The man chuckled, but there was no warmth to it. "You think you're a hero, don't you?" He shook his head. "Heroes don't win in this game, Zoe. They just get crushed." She didn't flinch. "Maybe. But at least I'm trying. What are you doing? Cleaning up after cowards?" For the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, maybe? Or doubt. Then it was gone. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said, stepping closer. "This isn't about one corrupt judge or a few bad cops." His voice lowered. "You're playing with fire, and if you keep going, you're going to burn." Zoe met his gaze, her voice steady. "Then let it burn." The last move. An hour later, they marched her back into the courtroom. The crowd had thinned, but her mother was still there, her face a mix of pride and terror. Judge Reed sat on the bench, but something had changed. He looked scripted, like a man forced to say words that weren't his own. "Miss Harper," he began, voice flat, "you've made quite a spectacle here today. However, this court cannot condone your actions. Tampering with evidence, theft, breaking and entering, these are serious charges." He folded his hands. "Do you understand the gravity of your situation?" Zoe didn't blink. "I understand that you're scared." Her voice was even. "And you should be." Reed's knuckles tightened around his gavel, but he didn't respond. Instead, he nodded to the suited men. One of them stepped forward and placed her laptop on the table. "This evidence," Reed announced, "is now in the custody of federal authorities." His gaze locked onto hers. "And as for you, Miss Harper, your fate will be decided in due time." Zoe's stomach dropped. They were burying it, The files, the truth, her fight. It was all being erased, right in front of her. Then she saw it, a tiny blinking light, a soft blue pulse on the side of the laptop. Her heart pounded. The live stream. It was still running. Her mother gave the smallest nod. And Zoe? She smirked. Somehow, someway. The world was already watching. The laptop sat on the prosecution's table, its tiny blinking light a silent declaration that the fight wasn't over. Zoe had one last shot, and she wasn't about to waste it. Judge Reed cleared his throat, tapping his gavel lightly. Before we continue, I'd like to remind everyone that this courtroom follows the rule of law. Miss Harper's theatrics do not override due process. Theatrics. Zoe almost laughed. That was rich, coming from a man who carried himself like a villain in a second-rate legal drama. But she didn't say anything. Not yet. At the back of the courtroom, the suited men who had confiscated her files stood like statues, their expressions unreadable. Zoe's mom sat in the front row, hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. The entire room felt like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. "Miss Harper," Reed continued, his voice dripping with faux authority, "do you have anything else to say in your defense, or have you exhausted all attempts at self-sabotage?" Slowly, Zoe stood. Her legs felt like lead, but her voice was unwavering. "Actually, Your Honor, I do have something to say, and I think you'll want to hear it." She turned to face the audience, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "Everyone in here knows the truth," she said, voice clear. "Maybe you don't want to admit it, but, you know, this system isn't broken. It's working exactly the way it was designed to." She paused, then locked eyes with Judge Reed. "It's built to crush people like me, like Will, like every name on that spreadsheet, and you," she pointed at him, her voice rising, "have been a part of it for years." The gavel slammed down. "That's enough," Reed snapped. "One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt of court." Zoe smirked, her heart pounding. "You're right, Your Honor. I don't respect this court. Not when it's run by people like you." And then it happened. The tiny blinking light on the laptop flickered. Twice. Then it stopped. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom as people reached for their phones. Zoe's smirk deepened. "Hey, Your Honor," she said, her tone as casual as if she were ordering coffee. "You might want to check the news." Reed's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" One of the suited men stiffened, pulled out his phone, and read something. His expression twisted into something close to panic. He stepped forward and whispered into Reed's ear. Whatever he said turned the judge's face ashen. Because while they had been busy confiscating her files, Zoe had already set her plan in motion. The moment the laptop had been connected to the court's network, it had done exactly what she programmed it to do: broadcast everything, every document, every video, every incriminating email. It was already out there, streaming across every major news platform, social media, and forums. By the time they had seized the laptop, it was too late. The room grew louder as more people checked their screens. Someone in the back shouted, "Is this real?" Another voice rang out, angrier, "They're all in on it!" Judge Reed slammed his gavel again. Hard. But it didn't matter. The courtroom was unraveling. Zoe leaned forward, her voice slicing through the chaos. "You can't stop it, Your Honor. The truth is out. And there's nothing you can do to take it back." One of the suited men snatched the laptop, yanking it away in frustration. But the damage was done. The courtroom doors burst open. A flood of reporters stormed in, cameras flashing, microphones pushed forward. Then came the federal agents. Their badges gleamed under the harsh lights. One of them, a tall man with a firm voice, stepped forward. "Judge Jason Reed," he announced, loud enough to silence the room. "You are under investigation for corruption, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." The courtroom erupted. Reed stood frozen, his gavel hanging limply in his hand. Zoe's mom covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Zoe?" She just stood there, arms crossed, watching the system she had fought against finally begin to crack. As the agents moved in, taking Reed into custody, he turned back to her, his expression twisted with hatred. But beneath that, something else lurked. Fear. A reporter shoved a microphone toward Zoe. "Miss Harper, how did you pull this off? Do you realize what you've done?" Zoe took a breath. Her heart was still racing, but her voice was steady. "Yeah," she said. She turned to her mother, who pulled her into a tight embrace. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zoe allowed herself a small smile. The fight wasn't over, not even close. But today, she had won. And the whole world knew it.